The town of Quahog was buzzing with holiday cheer as Thanksgiving fever took over. The annual Thanksgiving parade wound through the streets, filling the air with laughter, music, and an all-too-familiar scent of roasted turkey. Meanwhile, at the Griffin household, Joe and Bonnie Swanson were the first to arrive for Thanksgiving dinner. Lois had already warned Peter and Chris to be on their best behavior. After all, Joe and Bonnie had endured the painful loss of their son, Kevin, in the Iraq War. But, as more guests arrived, it became clear that it would be anything but a sensitive family gathering. Guests quickly filled the Griffins' living room, with Glenn Quagmire awkwardly shifting in his seat, still not fully comfortable around his dad since he transitioned to become mom. The usual mix of eccentric personalities was there, each adding their own quirks to the chaotic holiday scene. At precisely 2:30 p.m., Lois proudly announced that it was time to gather around the dining table, which was set with a feast fit for royalty. All eyes sparkled at the sight of the centerpiece, a perfectly roasted golden brown turkey. But just as they were about to dig in, the front door swung open. Standing in the doorway, much to everyone's disbelief, was Joe and Bonnie's son, Kevin Swanson, dressed in full army uniform. A stunned silence fell over the room as Kevin began to recount his story. 5 years ago, on Thanksgiving, his platoon in Iraq had been served a lavish turkey dinner. But as the first slice was carved, an explosion tore through the dining hall, leaving devastation in its wake. Kevin, who was thrown into a coma, was the only survivor. Due to the mix-up, his parents had received a letter proclaiming his death, while Kevin himself spent 5 long years unconscious in a military hospital in Kuwait. Only last week did he wake up and learn the full extent of what had happened. The room was a mix of shock, tears, and joy as Bonnie introduced Kevin to his baby sister Susie. Joe could hardly contain his pride, proudly declaring his son a war hero. Yet as Kevin sat down to catch up with his dad, a tiny slip threatened to unravel everything. During their chat, Kevin casually mentioned a movie he thought was fake. Joe's face fell. That particular film had only been released after Kevin supposedly entered his coma. Kevin quickly tried to cover his tracks, mumbling something before excusing himself to go outside and play catch, leaving Joe with a nagging doubt. Back at the table, as everyone sipped coffee and indulged in pumpkin pie, Peter couldn't help but chime in, asking to see Kevin's Purple Heart. Kevin shrugged, admitting offhandedly that he'd tossed his medals over the White House fence. Joe's suspicions deepened. Kevin had earlier said he flew straight from Kuwait to Quahog, no detour to Washington, D.C. Joe, sensing something amiss, pressed him further. In frustration, Kevin stripped off his army uniform, revealing an Ed Hardy t-shirt underneath. Joe's eyes narrowed. That shirt hadn't even hit the shelves until 2007, long after Kevin had supposedly fallen into a coma. Finally, Kevin snapped. He confessed, the words spilling out, he hadn't died in Iraq, he'd faked his death and gone AWOL. He explained that, initially, he'd gone to Iraq with a sense of duty. But after witnessing senseless violence and the death of innocent civilians, he realized he couldn't continue. During the chaos of the Thanksgiving attack, he found his chance to flee and took it. His convictions had only grown stronger over time. He believed Iraq had no link to 9/11, and the toll of the war was far too high, over 500,000 lives lost. Joe, however, was furious. His voice was firm as he reminded Kevin that his job was not to question orders but to follow them. But Kevin, unyielding, retorted that blindly following orders made them no better than Nazis. He pointedly reminded his father of a time when Joe had let a thief go free, understanding the man's desperation as he'd stolen to feed his hungry family. Sometimes, Kevin argued, breaking the law was the right thing to do. Joe looked hard at his son, then finally sighed, reaching out to unfasten the handcuffs he'd placed on Kevin. A heavy understanding passed between them, and as the guests returned to their food, laughter began to bubble back to the surface, thawing the atmosphere. Just when they were settling into the warmth of family and feasting, the door swung open again. Another Kevin stood in the doorway, breathless, declaring that the Kevin they'd just been speaking to was an imposter. Peter rolled his eyes, glancing at the clock. "Oh, we don't have time for that," he said, grinning, and the family went back to enjoying their Thanksgiving dinner, a little shaken but even more grateful for each other.